Hi, welcome to the XY Chromies, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers talk about veteran issues, geopolitics, science, and everything in between. I'm Pearson Guest, and I'm joined by, as always, by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How are you doing today, Richard?
If you didn't have no friends, you wouldn't have none at all.
Just
good to see
stumbling
you,
stumbling over my tongue left and right for the intro. It's good to see you too. So today is episode 22. We're going to be talking about the rise of the Soviet Union. But first, in this, we'd like to talk about some good news. In an era of doom and gloom news, it's nice to always have a good news story. And so we're going to go and start this episode off with one of those. What do you got for us today, Richard?
We have a little space news story. Here's the headline: NASA's solar sail successfully spreads its wings in space. All right, this is from space.com. More than 4 months after launching into space, a solar sailing spacecraft has successfully spread its wings above our planet. Nice. NASA's Advanced Composite Solar Sail System caught a ride into space on April 24th on Rocket Lab's Electron vehicle, and at the end of August, NASA shared in a release that its mission operations verified the technology reached full deployment in space. On Thursday, August 29th at 1:33 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the team obtained data indicating the test of the sail hoisting boom system was a success. There you go. That's the main slug.
Yeah. Awesome. You were going on a solar sail there for a second also.
I was drifting through space.
Yeah. How big was this one? I've been kind of paying attention to the solar sail technology as it's advanced. I know that there's a certain size that we're eventually trying to get to by like the end of the century that will allow for cross-galaxy exploration is the idea. I think it needs to be like a 1 square mile solar sail is the idea. I don't know if you've heard about that, but I was curious. So basically this one needs to be 10x twice or something like that. I forgot, but.
Well, I'll just jump down here past some of the those paragraphs in a news story that kind of flesh it out.
Mm-hmm.
Get the word count up. The location of the spacecraft in its orbit roughly 2 times the altitude of the International Space Station.
Okay.
If you were looking at the sail from above, it would look like a square that measures nearly half the size of a tennis court, approximately 860 square feet or 80 square meters. So we have a tennis court for comparison. That's approximately 4,000 cheeseburgers or 28 deer or 15 Danny DeVito's lanes end to end.
Wait, Danny DeVito from Step Brothers or Danny DeVito from Always Sunny? There's a difference in girth.
Let's see. Let's go with Always Sunny. He makes a better case.
Yeah.
There's a running gag in one of my friendships online that Americans will use anything except the metric system to measure things, and so every time we find an Ariana Grande as a unit of measure, we delight in it.
Yeah, we really we adopted the Italian nomenclature for coffee, though. We really love that for sizing. Jeez, but
well. You all may love it for sizing. I'm not a fan at all, but
no.
I know how to, when you're in Starbucks, you're family. And so that's why I use Venti and Grande.
I didn't know I had so many Italian family members. That's crazy. Yeah, Venti and Grande.
I came up with something goofy the other day, and it was a malapropism kind of by accident. And the person asked me, "Where did you get that from?" And I said, "Well, it's a malapropism." And they go, "What is that?" So I guess I'm full of them recently. I should get a role in public speaking so I can mess it up on tour.
Oh my God. That's where I stumbled upon, it's pornography. Not pornography, but the study of evil. I'm totally butchering the pronunciation, but yeah, it's very similar to pornography. But yeah, I stumbled upon this phrase because I was having a conversation about evil in general. Just fun fireside conversations that you have in general. The epistemology of evil.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I thought I would I flush out the news story a little bit because there's some related news stories I capture the text on. So from space.com, solar sails, which harness sunlight as sailboats harness the wind, could be affordable probes in the search for alien life on at least two icy moons in our solar system, Jupiter's Europa and Saturn's Enceladus, a new
Hmm.
study suggests. So um, I don't really have any specific mission for um, the solar sail that just unfolded in orbit. That's called the ACS-3.
Nice.
That has its own missions that it's going to engage in. But technologies such as solar sails may be one of the optimal ways for us to send probes and other robotic instrumentation to these two ice worlds at the two gas giants.
Yeah.
And what I think is a little interesting about this follow-on story is that I heard about Europa, and then I heard about Enceladus, and then I conflated them, and then I couldn't figure out if they were two separate things or two names for the same thing.
I
And
did it
then
similar because you kind of it's with Saturn and Jupiter, they have so many moons, you start to, and they're big, they're both
yeah,
large gas giants, and then you kind of
yep,
it's hard to kind of separate those two. I've heard more recent news about Europa just because we've gotten a lot more imaging back, I think, recently about what it looks like as far as like its hydrogen density and
yeah.
its many layers of ice and all of that. So Europa looks very promising if we can
Yeah.
overcome the coldness factor. Yeah.
They both have tidal forces being enacted upon them by their gas giant uh, home planets.
Yeah.
It's a better terminology for it. They so it's theorized that if those tidal forces are acting on those ice worlds, that there could be liquid ocean under them, and the potential of a thriving biome that lives around volcanic vents.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of different ways to get into space and a lot of different ways to travel in space. And one of the more cost-effective ways to do that is to use a solar sail, because you're harnessing uh, photonic energy from the sun in a vacuum, which actually can create some. We theorize that it can create quite a bit of velocity for a craft that's moving out into the outer regions of the solar system.
Well, it accelerates too. I mean, over time, it does. It
Yes.
accelerates over time. I mean, that when they're because they've been doing these solar sail theorizing, what it would take to
Mm.
get to another galaxy and stuff, and based on the size and as it picks up, as it accelerates over, thousands of light years, hundreds of light years, or whatever, it does pick up quite a bit of acceleration. Reg- Unlike the farther away it's being pushed by the sun, it's not moving slower necessarily, whereas you would think maybe like with wind, the source of the wind as it gets further away would not have as much of an effect on the sail. This isn't quite the case with these solar sails, if my understanding's correct.
Yeah, and when we use sails on Earth, we're catching the wind. That's both a colloquialism and the actual way that it works.
Yeah.
But we're not speeding. The wind gives us a velocity that is counteracted by the drag of whatever medium that we're sailing in, water usually,
Hmm.
and the opposing forces of the air, the molecules in the air. So we can only go as fast as the wind is carrying us, minus all of the other uh,
Friction,
negatives.
drag, yeah,
Exactly.
counter forces, basically. Yeah.
In space, we would expect that not to be the case. That something that picks up some velocity from solar wind would continue to pick up velocity as it continued to travel away, even as the solar wind. There's a barrier to our solar system that the sun has an effect on,
Hmm.
both gravity and photonic. And when I use the word photonic, I'm not trying to use a fancy word. That's literally what we would use to describe the effect of photons as light particles.
Sure.
So, unlike conventional rockets, which require a lot of fuel to generate thrust, solar sails leverage the subtle push of sunlight to cruise through space. They are propelled when photons or particles of light strike them and impart their momentum. This way, the light itself functions like the wind. I'm not going to read to the audience this entire breakdown of everything you need to know about Enceladus, except that
No,
it's an ice
I
world.
think, we've, the solar sail is pretty self-explanatory. Like, when it's powered by the sun, it's that it goes someplace. We get a certain threshold of width and of area, and whether that be cooking, we'll be able to, leave the solar system eventually and get to the outer ring, the belt, so to speak. And so super cool.
We seldom appreciate the mass of solar system material that's in the asteroid belt that orbits the sun between Mars and Jupiter. It's because it's not a single planet, so it's the stars of the show, which are the rocky worlds close to the sun, and then all the rest.
Yeah.
And we suspect that the asteroid belt contains unbelievable riches and possibilities from a mineral standpoint at a minimum. But there could probably also be a lot of water ice out there.
Planet X, that a ton of astrophysicists are like, they're more and more convinced based on like gravitational irregularities, and a large one out there to boot. I think Neptune's or Uranus, one of those are pretty big, or both of those are fairly big icy planets out there. So that pole that Pluto experiences out there as well, there's a mystery planet that many astrophysicists have been calling Planet X. They thought it might be a micro, like a really small black hole as well, was a theory, or a mini black hole. So they'll figure it out. I think by the end of the century, or maybe even by the end of the decade, we should know what's in that belt because of JWST.
Well, so let's specify that when we talk about the outer worlds, such as Neptune and Uranus, we're talking about planets that are much farther out of the solar system than the asteroid belt is. The asteroid belt is very near to us compared to Neptune's orbit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Which asteroid belt are you talking about? I'm thinking of the Permian, the outer belt of our solar system.
The Oort cloud.
Oort cloud, yeah, that's the one.
Our solar system has layers to it. It's a very nuanced and a lot of variety to it, and so we have all these different layers of rock that grow as you get farther away from the sun.
Yeah, so this is fascinating stuff.
I just watched The Expanse and learned all this. Didn't everybody else?
Yeah, The Expanse is legit a pretty fun show. I mean, it likes to drag out a story, I would say. And the main actor is to be wanting as far as charisma goes. But yeah, generally I like that show quite a bit. The premise of the show is strikingly realistic in a lot of ways. I feel like Amazon was just like burying the lead. They're like, will they know if we release this that we're releasing our strategic plan for solar system domination? So
Pearson, I just want to take umbrage with what you just said about the main character of the show not having charisma. I thought the Rocinante had a lot of charisma.
The Rocinante, yes, you're right. That's true. The Rocinante does have a lot of charisma.
And the supporting character of the
James Holden.
I'm forgetting her name now, but the Space Marine from Mars. There we go.
Yes, yeah. She was the New Zealander.
I also listened to the audiobooks in that series, which I do recommend to the audience if you are into that type.
They're on my to read list for sure. My mom's reading them right now, actually.
James S. Corey is the author, and if you punch that into your audiobook device, you'll find the books. And I listened to them out of order because I'd watched the TV show, so I just thought, well, I'll just get that extra detail that comes from it. But it's a faithful enough adaptation for book nerds, and the books give you what a seventh season would have portrayed.
I think the most faithful book adaptation I've ever seen and read has got to be Fight Club of all the movies and books. Like as far as like dialogue and like a lot of dialogue, there's some order stuff switched around a little bit in the movie, but the scenes are very similar and like kind of mirror each other for those two. And that's God, that's a local Portland author too. What's his name? Who wrote Fight Club and Choke and a bunch of other stuff? God, what's his name? How do I not know this?
Bobby Draper is the Space Marine's name I was trying to think of. She sort of has this
Draper, that's right.
Yeah, totally awesome Iron Man and from Mars kind of mystique. Chuck Palahniuk.
Jack Paul.
I know what you're all thinking. How can Richard know all these names and keep them all organized? I don't. I have the internet.
Yeah, God, my memory is just absolutely ass because of the internet. Thanks a lot, internet. But also, thanks a lot, internet.
Anyways, Chuck Palahniuk is that author.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered good news story about this space sail and the possible missions to the ice worlds in our solar system that are moons of larger planets. Should we get on to business?
Yeah, let's get into the biz. Sounds like at the end of for a quick recap, at the end we were discussing Lenin and what happened after the Soviet Revolution, essentially. And we're talking, I mean, Stalin was coming up because we were seeing the transition, and but a lot was happening at this period of time, and we really wanted to go. So today we're going to kind of cover the rise of the Soviet Union, and I think Richard, you had just looked up the date of when it officially was a union.
I'll read from the Wikipedia page, which is, you know, not beyond repute, but it's a pretty good starting point for a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, commonly known as the Soviet Union, was a transcontinental country that spanned much of Eurasia from 1922 to 1991. It was the largest country by area, extending 11 time zones and sharing borders with 12 countries. And the third most populous country. An overall successor to the Russian Empire, it was nominally organized as a federal union of 15 national republics, the largest and most populous of which was the Russian SFSR. That's a term we'd have to take apart because I don't remember what the SFSR stands for. It's basically a federation state. Mm-hmm. In practice, its government and economy are highly centralized. As a one-party state governed by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, it was a flagship communist state. Its capital and largest city was Moscow. So, okay, we started kind of back in the 19th century, and we began talking about two theorists of communism. And you remember their names?
Marx, and then Engels.
There you go, Engels and Marx.
I got him.
So we can attribute.
I got him this time. Engels, nailed it. I can keep it something. Okay.
So we can attribute the modern ideas of communism to Engels and Marx. Let me just footnote here and say, and also we can also split a million hairs a million ways about what I just said, because I'm to the point of being wrong. I'm oversimplifying what we're talking about for the audience.
Yeah, but we talked about it though. We talked about it quite a bit last episode also as well. So it's not too cursory, but yeah.
To give a heritage of how we got to where we are, I'm oversimplifying things to get there quickly because there's a lot of stuff packed into some years in the early 20th century that, you know, you could spend. If we're going to spend, I don't know, 10 episodes on this topic, we could spend 1,000 episodes just on 1917 alone.
Yeah.
So the historical narrative is that Vladimir Lenin, as we know him historically, that's his pen name, was a prolific author and publisher on the ideas of communism that came from Friedrich and Engels. Or excuse me, Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx.
Yeah.
Boy, going to make it really confusing. So Engels and Marx published these manifestos on communism, one being Das Kapital. One of the principal ideas from Marx and Engels' work was that the proletariat would convert their system of government from an authoritarian government to a social democracy through a movement of the unified workers, basically.
Yeah.
So parties of proletariat working class people would be a mass movement and move the country towards this glorified workers' paradise where they had preeminence over the direction that governments would take.
Yeah, the proletariat was non-land could be categorized generally as non-land owning workers or laborers. So this excluded, and this is an important distinction specifically for Russia, this excluded the peasant class. And later, because the peasant class would be labeled as part of the bourgeoisie, which were the aristocratic class, or considered the landowners or any of the people of money, the classical aristocracy with which Marx wanted to overthrow with the rule of the proletariat. And so just to understand these words, because some of them, they're not used in our common parlance, but you could imagine a factory worker as a proletariat, someone who didn't own land. They had to pay rents, and they didn't have any ownership. And they're essentially close to indentured servants because they're probably living in land owned by the place that their worker has, and things like this. So this is just to kind of set the stage of what Marx was identifying, because this is really important for people to understand, especially when Lenin writes his own version of, like, adds to and probably takes away to both Engels and Marx's original vision for how this looked. So I just wanted to do this quick detour so people didn't get confused by the language and what was happening.
So the distinction about the way that Vladimir Lenin approached the revolution in Russia to bring upon this glorious workers' paradise, and I think everyone can either detect my sarcasm or can realize that when Pierce and I are talking about this topic, we both have complicated views about what it means to bring people out of poverty. We have complicated views about what it means to give franchise to a population, that is to say, to have a say in how the government works. We have complicated points of view about what it means to protect working class people. And when we talk about what happened in Russia in 1916, 17, 18, 19, 20, this period of time, this concentration of time where these revolutions were happening, it's the antithesis, at least from my perspective, of how I would approach a more egalitarian state. Because instead of using Engels and Marx's perspective on the proletariat creating this dominant role in their government, Lenin's idea was to create a violent revolution, enlist the people that he could convince to go lockstep with his ideas, and then take over the government that way. And they were successful.
And to rule those people. His idea was, the biggest crux of his idea was to use that proletariat to get them to revolt violently, as a means to the end. He did love the greater good message that Marx and Engels were speaking to, the psychology of this, the greater good for the proletariat. We'll do this for them, but we must rule them because they're too dumb to understand the ideas for which we have to explain to them. And that was the crux of Lenin, essentially.
Also, a central idea to get our heads around with Vladimir Lenin's approach is that if you were not 100% on board with him, if you were not able to parrot back to him exactly what he was saying and writing, you weren't in his coalition. You were outside of his coalition. And so even at the very beginning, where you have these two different factions within the Communist Party, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks,
Hmm.
the Mensheviks. Imagine if history would have gone differently. We still might have got a communist state in Russia, but maybe a very different version of a communist state in Russia, because the Mensheviks did not think of it the way that Lenin did. And so they fell out with each other. There was conflict between the two of those parties. And the Bolsheviks ultimately were the more successful in the end, if for no other reason than because of some accidents of history, some lucky, you know,
I,
uh, circumstances. They were violent. They moved things along with violence.
yeah, I was going to
People
say
were desperate.
Bolsheviks were, Lenin understood the needing to influence the majority within the new parliamentary systems that were being created. So when the Mensheviks, started to have elections and started to try and form this government. I mean, it was having a revolution at the same time. It was having to
Yeah.
manage an army. There were outside armies that were gaining to fight these new communist parties on the periphery of Russia also that were not happy about the Bolsheviks or the Mensheviks, either of them. And the Mensheviks thought the Bolsheviks would, hey, we're both two sides of the same coin. We should be, but that wasn't what was happening. Lenin was totalitarian in mindset, and I think you describe him very well. Totalitarianism is what, and authoritarianism isn't enough of a word for Lenin. He was totalitarianism. You needed to 100% buy into everything he said. And which is why, as we've discussed before, Stalin was, he considered one of his favorites, because Stalin was so good at, and Stalin knew psychology. I think he understood Lenin very well. He respected Lenin a lot, but he also knew that he could not cross Lenin, and he understood that Lenin was totalitarian. And which is why when he went against him with leading that army into, not leading the army into Warsaw in Poland, he knew it was a bad move, but he had to make that move because he was stuck between an ultimate rock and a hard place for his career politically. He understood it was suicide to try to go to invade Poland, Warsaw, and it was also probably political suicide to come back.
So the Bolsheviks are trying to form they're trying to form and perfect their communist state in Vladimir Lenin's view. All the while, there is a civil war going on. All the while, I mean, this is happening at the end of World War I. So they went into a embarrassing negotiation with the Germans and forfeit property and land, and they reset national boundaries. I mean, it was a total it would have been a totally embarrassing loss to the Russian aristocracy, but to Lenin, who had a long game in mind, he just thought, we're going to have a global communist brotherhood. It's not going to matter. Borders aren't going to matter when we're done here.
Mm-hmm.
So, he accepted the terms of this mortifying treaty and moved on so that they could pursue crushing the White Army as one of the internal factions that was rising up in civil war, and handling incursions from Poland, which now was emboldened because of this embarrassing treaty that had been signed.
Yeah.
Right? There are all these different things that were going on in the late 19-teens, in the immediate, before the completion of World War I, in the immediate aftermath of World War I, and in the 5 years after World War I.
Yeah, and it wasn't a secret. The people understood what Lenin wanted and what the Bolsheviks were coming after. People in Russia were very much opposed to Lenin. They did not like him. There was a good majority who did like him, obviously the proletariat and the Bolsheviks. But there was a bunch of people who understood he was an authoritarian. He wanted to be a dictator. They were going to run the country as a dictatorship. And there was a lot of people who were opposed to what Lenin was doing. So I think sometimes people think that it happened so quickly. Suddenly Lenin shows up and Russia's just communist right away. But this isn't how things happen.
No.
Rarely does. I mean, I've on a quick digression. I've been listening and studying a little bit of the Menchin, the Menchin dynasty that happened in 1852 in Japan, because I was curious about the Russo-Japanese War, and then before I knew it, I had to go there. And I would say that's probably one of the swiftest changes fundamentally of a country I've ever read about or listened about at all. It's pretty phenomenal, and we will definitely dedicate in the future an episode or two to what they did, because frankly, it should be a lesson for many countries to follow if they're facing existential crises of identity, or maybe they're a new democracy for the first time. Studying what Japan did in the 1850s is pretty phenomenal. That's my quick digression. But yes, even though Russia did change very fast, really, it was changing quick for the last 20 years. It was ripe for change. Many countries were changing really fast during this period of time as well.
Yeah.
So,
And what the wind in the sails of this change that came to pass. And you bristled when I said there were a couple of lucky things that happened. Well, you can bring on a famine on purpose, but there were famines to take advantage of. There was bread lines and people having to do without during the war because of mismanaged supply lines and mismanaged logistics. There were all these different things that were just making people in the population centers really grumpy with the aristocracy and with the Tsar Nicholas's regime. And as we've pointed out, you definitely mentioned this. He thought it'd be a good idea to go to the front lines and lead his troops in the front, which always sounds great. But that only really works during empire building. And when you've got the empire, the time to do that is done. And now the people that you send to the front lines are your most qualified, highly trained generals and administrators that understand how warfare works, which they didn't really have. And that's part of the reason why he thought that'd be a good idea to go ahead and show them that the boss is here. And these things all led to the downfall of the Tsar Nicholas's family was called the Romanovs.
The Romanovs, yeah.
The Romanov dynasty. And as the dynasty was crumbling, and this is something I'm not going to be able to go into a whole lot of detail with, but as the dynasty was crumbling, there were heirs that were in line to take the role of Tsar, and they just knew that it was essentially laying your head on the chopping block.
Yeah, Alexander, who was a Menshevik, I think he was like, no, let them. They can.
Yeah,
they'll have a vote. Yeah, and I think Nicholas the Tsar II was shocked, is what it was written at. He was absolutely flabbergasted that you wouldn't want to take the crown. It sounds like Nicholas the Tsar. I mean, and this happens to kind of these these regal governments, or what is it? These monarchies over a long period of time. The last leaders of a monarchy seem to be the most delusional about the situation that they're in. They've been, something about the aristocracy that pads the leadership so much so. I think this is a common story. We talked about this in the Ottoman Empire. This started to happen to the sultans of the time in the Ottoman Empire. Nicholas Tsar sounded very delusional. And he might have been pretty delusional, just based on some of these decisions he was making. These are the decisions of someone who is completely overestimating their own capabilities, completely underestimating the situation around them, completely underestimating the unhappiness and it would be one thing to take the lead when you're losing so badly by the leader is a decision you make out of desperation when you think, if I don't lead them, I'm going to die anyways. When we lose this war, they'll overthrow me. And if that was just the case, that would have made sense. But the fact that he was so surprised to hand off the crown to a cousin and him not receive it well, it seemed like he still had quite a bit of delusion, that he was like, oh wait, well, they'll just kill me, but our kingdom will still persist as the empire state that we are.
Something I want to mention about the conditions of Russia at the beginning of World War One is that, I mean, I'm taking it as a historical fact because I'm not interested in interrogating it that much. Russia had the largest army in terms of manpower. So when we talk about an army size, definitely rank and file troops, non-commissioned officers and commissioned officers all counted together is an important number. A large army is counted by the people who fill the ranks.
Sure.
What the military that Pearson and I served in is a large military for sure, but it's a different type of military than just a large military. Promotions, advancements, awards, decorations, and all kinds of informal attaboys are handed to those who are the best at logistics. are handed to those of us who are very good at moving a pallet of water bottles 800 miles effectively. And the thing that we can deduce from the war the Russians were prosecuting was that even though there were people that had tactics, they understood how to perform maneuvers that would get them advantages on the battlefield, they did so without a material support system, the likes of which we would recognize in our military experience.
Well, the Germans knew logistics very well for the last four during this period of time. They had 400 years of being one of the mercenary country that, was about battle. And, I was recently reading more to bring up that Japanese dynasty that I was talking about. The Meiji dynasty. Yes. Yep. Meiji. They went to the Germans to learn warfare.
Yes.
Through and through, all the way through. But the Germans told them, go to the Brits for the Navy. And they listened to them. The Germans told them, hey, Korea is a knife pointed at your country. You don't know the Russians very well yet, but they're going to get to know you when they figure out that right there. So really, if you want to blame, and, of course, the Germans who have been fighting the Russians for 400 freaking years off and on. So a couple things come to mind. First off, of course, the Germans are like, hey, watch out for Russia. To the Japanese, they're going to say that. And they weren't wrong, obviously. I mean, they actually weren't wrong to tell them to that. But how did the Russians not get better at logistics after hundreds of years of fighting the damn Germans, who would, I'm just very curious. And it seems, the obvious answer would be that sometimes the Russians just won with sheer numbers.
Yeah.
And then the Germans had to use logistics and strategy and all the other things to try and beat the Russians. And Russia has basically just won for 400, 500 since the inception of their empire with just numbers. And they're just like, well, that strategy seems to work for us, so we'll just keep doing that till 2024.
Russians could tolerate high attrition for each of their battle victories. High rates of attrition for each of their battle victories. And that is a strategy. And as long as everyone back home is totally cool with their sons dying in battle for the glory of Mother Russia, I guess it works. But the 20th century, we had reached the end of that. The Russians were kind of done with that kind of treatment as a population, and they demonstrated it by allowing this hostile, violent takeover of their political system by this fancy upstart that literally came out of Germany, like literally their cultural enemies. Marx and Engels were Germans, or I know Marx was. I'm forgetting what Engels must have been. We'll have to look it up.
We'll look it up.
Anyway, so these ideologies came out of the industrialized mid-century Germany, mid 19th century, and that they tolerated this happening says a lot about how done they were as a population with being used as a brute force instrument in all of their diplomacy by any other means.
It's ironic, isn't it, a little bit, that it feels so much like Central and West Africa right now, with them releasing, shirking the burden of the French oppression that has essentially dominated their country, those countries for the last century and a half or so. That right now, the last 10 years, they've been shirking that and going, hey, Russia looks okay, because they're just so fed up with the mistreatment of generally the oppression, the financial oppression, the economic oppression of the French, and then the actual physical oppression that many of these African countries suffered from the French directly through colonial rule. That Russians in this juncture in the 1917 period, completely fed up with being used like the meat grinder, would adopt. It's like going out of the frying pan into, directly into the fire, essentially, with Lenin, and this new system. So we see right now, we see history playing out in different countries with very similar situations where people are stuck in a situation. You see it happening, and they're choosing the wrong option, but because they're so fed up with the other option and the mistreatment, that they're like, oh, well, screw this. Maybe Russia's better than France. Many African countries are flirting with that notion, or they've bought into that notion already. They're like, maybe Russia's better than France. I have to warn you, it's not. But
All right. So we've got a really solid basis for understanding what the Communist Party is as a Leninist version of communism.
Yeah.
We have an understanding of what happened to move Russia from an aristocracy of the Romanov dynasty into the communist state that we said at the beginning of our conversation today that happened in 1922. So 1922 is just a few short years after the end of World War I, and a few short years after Lenin was sent back to Russia. The Germans gave him free passage back to Russia to foment this ultimate collapse of the political system in Russia, and create the series of events that would lead to that embarrassing treaty for Russia. And so 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics has begun. And before I ask my question, let's remember that Soviets are the terminology they're using for. Yeah, it's the local organizations. It's not the same as a workers' union, but it's essentially the local organization that is the body of that group of people who know what they're doing.
Yeah.
So you could kind of compare it. We could say, a labor union in this country could be also called a Soviet, but it wouldn't be quite the right analogy anyway. So it's a union of all these different organizations that represent their labor class. And Vladimir Lenin, well, he was never never identified as the grand leader of all of this. Like, he was never installed as the supreme dictator of all of this. What he was the chair of the committee that managed all of the Soviets. So he was the senior.
Yeah, if you manage all, this is where Stalin already knew this, Lenin knew this, and in fact, most people should know this. If you're the senior administrator and all the power is centralized at the administrative level, you are the leader of that entire government. And that's how that works. And Lenin knew this, Stalin absolutely knew this, and President Xi knows this right now, currently. By the way he rose to power in the Communist Chinese Party was he took many boring ass administrative positions that were like Department of Agriculture here and there or whatever. I mean, Department of Agriculture in the U.S. is a very sought out commission board. Many high level Congress people try to be on that department, so I shouldn't downplay it. But for the sake of this analogy, like, he would take what would be considered mundane administrative positions because no one wanted to do them, and would put in place officials that were loyal to him and into that area, and then move to another one. And Lenin did this. So I'm sorry, when you said there was good luck of when the reason the Bolsheviks were taking over, and then it was violence, but also Lenin understood the administration. He was very good at administrative levels. And so he was putting people into parliamentary positions to get the majority from the Mensheviks at the time. I remember this was politically what was happening. Stalin was helping with this as well. They were very big on Stalin was big on oh, I can do that boring job if I can put a couple people that are loyal to me in this position. And that was the big thing is finding where you lacked in power to create a majority to give yourself the power. And yeah.
So when I refer to luck playing a role in this, and again, this is one of those things where I'm going to mention kind of a tangent we could really take and go down and explore. But the role that Joseph Stalin played as a brigand, they were robbing banks and taking treasuries from local municipalities around.
From people who had treasuries, back
right.
then.
The Russian sphere, he was involved in stealing money that ultimately led to the progress of this enterprise, and the fact that he was never shot in the middle. Right, he didn't die in the act of stealing money from people is one of those sliding doors of history where he just lucked out and survived to become the replacement to what we were going to call him the premier of the Soviet Union. Yeah, the Lenin, senior most administrator of the Soviet Union, I think I want to say is the premier. I'm blanking here. It's going to come to me in a second. But that he ultimately took this role as the senior administrator, but did so with the full intent and expectation of being the dictator of that in that role.
Absolutely. One of the things, what's so funny about the prescription of Marxism, the problem with Marxism is it was written for non-intellectuals to adopt by some of the most intellectual minds of the time who were trying to create top-down, completely comprehensive systems of governance and social restructuring, completely restructuring society in every single way. Marx and Engels were attempting to do this. This was super popular during the mid-1800s. And Marx and Engels were really the ones who were writing the last version of one of these really popular ones that took place. But it was written by intellectuals, and Lenin was an intellectual, and he recognized that the proletariat were way too dumb to be taught this. I mean, he was extreme, and when I'm saying they were way too dumb, his cynical mind was saying that they were too dumb because he thought lesser. There's hierarchies that are supposed to be dispelled with communism, and Lenin did not agree with that by the very nature of his structure of government. He knew that there were class hierarchies, and that I think cynically found this as a means to an end to justify him taking over power. And communism proved to be a very effective method of taking a government that was a system, a society that was completely different than what it was, and restructuring it to consolidate power within that country. Communism proved to be a very powerful roadmap for how to do that, I believe.
So I just want to mention that I happened to luck into being right this time. The government was headed by a chairman, most commonly referred to as the premier of the Soviet Union.
Nice. And
several deputy chairmen throughout its existence. So this is kind of the interesting. So ultimately what Pierce and I are ramping up to is a couple of different ideas, and one of them being just the distinction of how we think about the executive of our country, how we select that executive, and what role that executive has in the operation of the administration of the country. And a premier or a chairman is a different job, even though it is a single person at the top of an executive system.
Yeah.
It's structured differently. And the idea in this communist structure is that there would just be a multitude of different groups within a party structure where the chairperson or premier would have tie-breaking authority. They would be able to. They would have
Mm-hmm.
administrative roles where they were able to say, yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to do this thing that I'm going to lay out for everyone. And if it wasn't, let's see, I hate to denigrate the good Russian people, but if it wasn't a country like Russia that this started in, if it was a different type of mentality, you could imagine how people would be more egalitarian in its administration and would come up with ways to do it that weren't violent and cynical and paranoid and all the different really negative things that we could say about this organization. Anyway, I just wanted to clarify. Stalin became its premier. And the thing I wanted to let's see where I'm at. Okay, so we've identified the start date of the Soviet Union,
Yep.
1922.
Also, this same year that Lenin has his stroke as well, at the end of the year, I guess, or after this happened, or during. Actually, I'm not sure on the timeline. Do you know?
Yeah, Lenin dies in 24, but
yes,
the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic is ratified as a nation and recognized as a nation in 1922. So Joseph Stalin is not the premier yet. He will be.
Yeah.
And let's see here. Stalin, 1924.
And we discussed he got in with Lenin when he was, after he had his stroke and he was bedridden. Stalin was at his side until Lenin died, essentially, and was positioning himself for power the whole period of time. He had even made it so that Lenin's wife was not able to have very much access to him. And he was doing everything in his power to keep Trotsky busy, because Trotsky was his largest rival at the time. And to the point where when Lenin did die, Stalin made sure Trotsky was on a vacation in like the southwestmost corner. I mean, it was in the Black Sea, I believe, because they had like power out there in Crimea area. I mean, that was one of the first areas that the Soviet Union had some power. So
Joseph Stalin, we're doing a little, for the audience, the place we are in history is the early 1920s. And we bounce around a lot with our retelling of this history because of all these interesting tangents, but I want to bring it back to this focus.
Yeah.
Which is 1922, Vladimir Lenin has a series of strokes that disable him entirely. He's alive, but he's incapable of functioning as the chairperson of the Soviet Republic, the premier. He can't do it. Eventually, he dies in 1924, where he's replaced. So I'm going to do a little reading from Wikipedia, which is our favorite thing. Joseph Stalin, and he was born. Let's just say that I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce his actual birth name here because it's a little too Georgian for my ability to pronounce.
Yeah.
So he's born in 18 December 1978, and he dies 5 March 1953. So this is a man who spans the century divide. He lives from the 19th century into the 20th century. He lives through the mid 20th century. He was a Soviet politician and revolutionary who led the Soviet Union from 1924 until his death in 1953. He held power as General Secretary of the Communist Party. All right, so we've talked about this distinction of how their executive is described. From 1922 to 1952, and chairman of the Council of Ministers from 1941 until his death in 1953. Okay, so General Secretary of the Communist Party. It doesn't sound like a dictator, but that's what he was. And the reason that I wanted to bring this emphasis to this conversation is because it's not what Stalin did, it's who he scared. Us.
Yeah.
He
terrified
us.
He should have. Stalin was a terrifying person.
Yes.
Stalin commanded all the fear that he garnered from us. we've mentioned some of the atrocities that he's done already. I mean, I think it was in the 180,000 different documents that he signed personally that had hundreds of names on each of them that were either to the gulag, to Siberia, or to their death. He signed these documents, I assume, more than daily. I mean, there had to have been hours of, I mean, every hour, once a day, probably a couple, like at least an hour of signing documents where he would write his name down next to certain people, like, haha, laugh about, he would write
Kill this one,
traitor.
lol.
Yeah, kill this one. Exactly. I mean, he was basically memeing on these people. It was awful, completely disrespectful. Or sometimes it would say there would be someone sentenced to death. Instead, he would be like, "Oh no, just give him 30 years in Siberia." Ha ha ha. Like for fun. He's like, "Yeah, death's too short for that person. Let them suffer for 30 years." This was the guy that Stalin was.
Yeah.
I think it was Stalin was it Stalin or Lenin who labeled the peasants as part of the bourgeoisie?
It's a good question. I don't recall the exact that specific designation, but if I were to take a guess, and we'll see if I'm pilloried for my guess, it would have been Lenin.
I think you're right.
Because he what
yeah.
Communism was ideally for the people laboring in industry, but people who were farming were kind of left out in the cold on this.
Not even left out. They were targeted by Lenin as the enemy. They were suddenly, you imagine you're some farmer who's poor as hell. You lose kids like every year to the winter. And suddenly this guy Lenin shows up. He's like, hey, that's part of the rich class right there. They own land. They're rich. Look at them.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, can you imagine just like the average poor farmer for once is being called rich, and these aren't CAFOs in America. We're talking about like, a mom and pop farm.
There are still livestock pulling plows for their daily bread.
Yeah,
they're not thinking of themselves
for their potatoes.
They have always been under the thumb of somebody or in debt to somebody.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the idea of this, the reason I get them mixed up is because going through all this, I have so many different stories of mistreatment to the farmers by both. Yeah. And now I guess I'm specifically remembering Stalin then was the one who the Communist Party was demanding all of the meat rations from all of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine. And Ukraine ate all of their meat. The farmers ate all their meat in protest, and then went through one of the worst famines in history to the point where there was cannibalism in Ukraine.
Yes.
And because cannibalism is a through line for communism, and yes, I'm going to say that again, cannibalism is a through line for communism in the last century. There's been cannibalism, large scale events of cannibalism due to the effects and the bureaucracy of communism. And this is superseded just a country. This is Ukraine we're talking about. There was cannibalism in Russia, and there was cannibalism in China. So some of the largest communist countries in the world during the height of communist era, the most powerful communist countries in the world, frankly, had large scale cannibalistic events. Not events. It wasn't like there was just like a whole bunch of people running around eating each other. It just meant there were periods of famine and starvation where people started to eat their dead, and have to boil each other down for lye and fat and all kinds of other disgusting things you can imagine that completely dehumanize people. So, yeah.
Fun fact: the conquistadors also did this in Mexico. They thought so highly of the Aztecs that they treated them the same way.
I hate to end the podcast on this note, but my dog is whistling at me, which means she's got to go right away. So I'm gonna go do that, and then we're gonna pick this right up our next episode right after this. So, anyways, I'm sorry for us to end it on such a dour note, but it's important to understand what communism really means and what its effects really were and how it was executed versus how it was, I guess, envisioned. And really how the envisioning wasn't really good either. It wasn't well thought out. So I think we've set the stage pretty well for the next episode. So Richard, I'll talk to you soon.
Hey, you take care of that pup, and I'll talk to you soon.